Welcome, everybody. I'm very thrilled that there's an audience here, and we're here with St. Louis University 200th Anniversary Homecoming. So the Bander Center for Medical Business Ethics is an ethics center that's housed in the School of Medicine at St. Louis University that focuses on education and research about issues in medical business ethics. It was established in 2007 based on a charitable grant from Dr. Stephen Bander and the BF Charitable Foundation, which is his charitable foundation. I'm Jason Kuhn, the executive director of the Bander Center. We have an educational mission, a scholarly arm, and we put on events like this one. My highest hope is that someone here today will get a spark from something that is said, or meet someone compelling to collaborate with, start a project, network, invest in something worthwhile, start a company, change the world for the better. I would first like to welcome all these attendees who are here today as part of the St. Louis University 200th Anniversary Bicentennial Homecoming Weekend. I thank you to everyone who's decided to join us today for our first signature event of the school year. So I'm thrilled that my guest today is Spencer Wells. Spencer Wells is a geneticist, anthropologist, author, and entrepreneur. For over a decade, he was an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society and director of the Genographic Project, which collected and analyzed DNA samples from hundreds of thousands of people around the world in order to decipher how our ancestors populated the planet. In the process, launching the consumer genomics industry. Wells graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Texas at Austin and received his PhD from Harvard University and conducted postdoctoral work at Stanford and Oxford. He has appeared in numerous documentary films and is the author of 3 books: The Journey of Man, Deep Ancestry, and Pandora's Seed. His work has taken him to more than 100 countries, where he has collaborated with everyone from heads of government and Fortune 500 corporations to tribal chieftains eking out a precarious living in places as remote as Chad, Tajikistan, and Papua New Guinea. He lives in Austin, Texas, where he is founder and CEO of consumer genomics startup Insitome, an adjunct professor at the University of Texas, and owner of the iconic blues club and Tones. So, Spencer, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about direct-to-consumer genomics. I want to get to a chance to talk about your company, Insitome, but first I want to talk about direct-to-consumer genomics more directly and more generally. So first, can you just describe what direct-to-consumer genomics is, just to get us on the same page?
Yeah, it's this ability that people now have and have had for a little over a decade to send off a saliva sample or a cheek swab and query things in their genome. So people might be interested in learning more about their ancestry, or you might want to learn something that's medically relevant. Maybe you have a family history of a certain trait or an illness. And for the last 10, 15 years, people have been able to do that. As the name implies, direct to consumer. Which I actually don't like. I prefer calling it just consumer genomics, because we don't talk about direct-to-consumer book selling. It's just a given that people should be able to buy books directly. But this is a big debate that's going on, particularly in terms of the medical side of things, with the FDA stepping in and saying, well, maybe consumers are not ready to have access to this information on their own. Maybe they need to be guided through the process. But in general, consumer genomics is the ability to test your DNA on your own, anonymously, and get the results back, typically delivered in a website. Learn something about yourself.
I see. I'll try to correct what I'm saying. I might say direct-to-consumer genomics again, because that's the way I'm conceiving.
It's become an acronym, DTC.
But I'll try my best. Let's see what happens. So you're telling me that you can get a saliva sample and get someone's genome from that.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, so let's step back in time. I started graduate school in 1989, and at that time we were still debating whether it was theoretically possible to sequence an entire human genome. So with the technical methodology we had at the time, one person, one highly trained, efficient person, could sequence maybe 400 nucleotides in a day. Now, to put that in context, there are 3 billion nucleotides in the human genome. So if you multiplied across all the people who had that skill set and then divided into the total size of the genome, in principle, it would take centuries to sequence a human genome. And so we were saying, well, it's never going to happen. Human Genome Project launches, some new technology comes online in the 1990s, and suddenly by the year 2000, 2001, we have a draft of a single genome. It took over a decade and billions of dollars. The estimate is between $3 and $5 billion. The technology has now moved on so rapidly that you can sequence an entire human genome in one day for less than $1,000. And that price is rapidly dropping, so we're probably going to hit a price point closer to $100 next year, and maybe closer to $10 or even free within a few years. And so, it's very easy to generate genetic data today, and the issue is how do you interpret this information? And this is what plays into the regulatory side of consumer genomics, is to what extent are, number one, the testing methodologies accurate, but then what about the interpretations as well? If you're talking about disease risk in particular, what's the level of accuracy in your estimates?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so that's great. I like. Let's talk about privacy. Let's get into some ethics, I think.
Sure.
Is
there any such thing as privacy anymore?
Yeah, right, good. That's a question, right? Is there such thing as privacy? I mean,
there are now 6 blockchain genomics companies that have been founded just in the last year.
What is that? So
it's a way of tagging data with a very complex algorithm that allows you to tell when the information is being used and by whom.
Okay.
And you essentially have to give permission for this to happen.
Okay.
As part of the process. But we live in a post-privacy world in many ways.
I love it.
Okay,
so
so when we launched the Genographic project back in 2005, which we had a public participation component, never thought it would really take off, quite honestly. I suspected it might, but the then CEO of National Geographic actually pulled me aside in April of 2005 as I was about to announce the project on stage at National Geographic headquarters. And he said, listen, don't oversell this whole consumer thing. Like, nobody's going to spend $100 to test their DNA. So we sold 10,000 kits on the day we announced the project, and we had 100,000 a few months later by the end of the year. And suddenly the industry was born, 23andMe, Ancestry, and so on. But when we launched that, there was really no social media to speak of. People were much more concerned about what they revealed online. And the kits, by their very nature, the way we designed them, were anonymous. So now, when you take one of these tests, you create an account, you tag your email address, it's connected to the DNA sample and the results. In those days, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to be in the position, for instance, of having someone come in with a subpoena and saying, you have to show us your database and reveal who's tested and what the results are. So we put an anonymous code, random multi-letter code, into every kit. And that's what you use to log in. There was literally no way to get to your results if you lost that code. And people complained about that. They said, we don't care about anonymity. We want to be able to tag it with our email addresses and reset the password. So things have certainly changed. I mean, and the end result of that is I don't know if there really is privacy anymore, but between social media and the things that everybody shares.
Mm-hmm. So what people are doing, they're revealing their genomes with agency, right? I mean, the people are saying it's okay for the world to know my genome.
Yep.
I mean, so you really, I want to know how you characterize privacy in your line of work, in your world. And it sounds like there is no concept of privacy. I mean, do you think your concept?
Well, there should be. There should be in principle.
Yeah, there should be a principle. So people on your end of the bargain, the ones that are doing it. I mean, do you have a different concept of privacy than maybe the consumer?
No, it's just that consumers have consistently wanted to reveal their results. People have downloaded their data and shared it in a public forum. GEDmatch is perhaps the best known. That's recently, just in the last few months, started to be used to solve criminal cases. Yeah. So the Golden State Killer, very famous case that was in the news back in April and May of this year. They used these genealogical consumer DNA tests, the data of people who downloaded the data and shared it openly. in this public forum. And so people are choosing to reveal all of this information. Again, not something I expected when we launched the industry, but it's consistently what people have been pushing for.
Oh, yeah, I bet. I'm thinking of a situation where, a big consumer genomics company sold a lot of its de-identified data, to GlaxoSmithKline, I think, or something like that.
23andMe just signed a deal.
Millions.
300 million.
And, that's different, because I don't know if the consumer was involved in that decision. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think
Does that
probably.
change it? How does that nuance it?
Yeah, I think probably most people who are taking these tests don't think of the ways the data might be used. I mean, you were given a gift, and these are some of the most popular gifts during the holiday season. Last year on Amazon, they were some of the best-selling products in the marketplace. And people buy them, give them to their grandparents, perhaps, who are interested in genealogy. They get their DNA tested for ancestry purposes, but they perhaps don't realize that their genetic information might be used in these other ways. And if you read the terms and conditions carefully enough, of course it's revealed in there, but how many of us go through 27 pages of fine print when we're taking an ancestry DNA test?
Yeah, right. I guess it calls to mind, who owns the data? Once the data's there, I mean, company owns it, right?
Well, no, in principle, the individual does. The individual can withdraw at any time, but it's a non-trivial process.
It's a non-trivial process
to actually withdraw completely from the database, erase the fact that you were ever tested.
Yeah. What about privacy in the long run, or we'll call it something like privacy, what we're talking about here? In the long run, meaning, say one of these companies has, huge database of genetic information, folds, goes out of business, right? It's a dynamic industry. There's coming into the market, going out of the market, stuff like that happens. I'm sure Insitome is going to persist far into the future and healthy. But, I can't imagine other companies may not be so successful in the long run. So what does a company like that do with the data if it's, out of business?
That's a very good question. I mean, databases have been bought and sold over the years. So it is possible that the DNA information that you provide to company X may end up being owned by company Y. In my opinion, really that should involve a reconsent process for the transfer of the information. But this is all new ground in terms of ethics and law.
And you're on the forefront, so that's why we're stoked to have you as a guest.
Well, it's great to be here again.
Yeah, I'd say let's think about. I think this is still related to privacy in a way, but I want to talk about this Golden State Killer, right? His name is Joseph James D'Angelo. He was brought to justice by some careful sleuthing by a kind of geneticist, maybe named...
Genetic genealogist.
A genetic genealogist, Barbara Ray Venter is her name.
Who's related to Craig Venter.
That's wild, that it's a small world, isn't it? It's like there are about 8 of you people kind of sitting around. I don't know, but so anyway, and some other investigators were able to get some genetic data from a crime scene back in 1970 something, right?
70s and 80s.
70s and 80s, right? They kept it frozen, and they got the DNA, and matched that to some of this killer's relatives' genomes in open source databases, like the type you're talking about, where
GEDmatch is the one they use.
GEDmatch. Okay, GEDmatch is a thing where I might have gotten my genome sequenced by a private company, and I myself uploaded that data to GEDmatch, right?
Because you want to reanalyze it, find out something new.
Something new. That may be one. Okay, got it. Okay. So can you describe, how they did that? My understanding is they didn't need to go into any private company's data set. I mean, I think we got it, right? I mean, it's that.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the methodology they used is that Joseph D'Angelo never tested his DNA with one of these consumer genomics companies. This was all done effectively by triangulating through relatives. And so they had his DNA from the crime scene, and they went in and they used more up-to-date methods, the ones that are actually being used by the consumer genomics companies to do the testing, where you look at literally hundreds of thousands of variable positions in the genome, as opposed to what the FBI uses, the CODIS data set, which is literally 13 to 18 markers, depending on when they did the testing, whether it was early 90s or more recently, but a tiny, tiny subset of the genetic variation in the genome. So this is 1990s technology that's being used by the FBI and by law enforcement. So what they did was they updated, that process, and then they went in and they looked for cousin matches. And so the interesting thing is, when you test your genome, you're really testing the genomes of all the members of your immediate family. So we can tell who your parents are and your siblings are, your first cousins, your second cousins, your third cousins pretty accurately, and somewhat less accurately fourth and fifth cousins. And so in a database that's full of data from 1 million people, you're potentially touching on hundreds of millions of people by extension, their cousins. And so effectively that's what they did. They went into this database and they found the family members who were kind of overlapping in certain segments of their genome. And that gave them an individual, or actually a couple of individuals to target. They then kind of staked out that individual, and as he was coming out of a Wendy's or a Taco Bell, threw away his drink with saliva on the straw. They quickly retrieved that, tested it, and boom, it was a match.
That's wild.
It's a pretty amazing process.
Wild. Okay.
And again, this all started with people being interested in their genealogy and their deep ancestry, and am I Irish American, and what percentage, Finnish am I, or Sardinian, or it's incredible.
Well, I mean, so one thing that suggests to me is that a lot of people upload their genome to a public database.
1 million people so far. Now the private databases are even bigger.
Really?
Yeah, so Ancestry has, in excess of 10 million people in its database. So they're the largest. 23andMe has about 5 million people who've tested. Genographic is around 1 million. So, yeah.
Okay. It calls to mind this. I mean, if they could do this, in a legitimate way, a government, court, an investigator, legit people.
And it's been done multiple times since then.
Right, but I mean, triangulation is a technique that anyone could use. What about a nefarious actor? You know what I mean?
It's entirely possible.
Is it happening? And
you could certainly frame someone. I mean, I think that hasn't happened yet as far as we know, but it's conceivable that you might take someone's genetic information from one of these databases. You can order, oligonucleotides, so synthesized DNA online with a credit card. And if you're committing a crime, you could choose to sprinkle some of that around the crime scene. So
I drink a soda
it's a brave
with
new
a
world.
straw. I throw it in a trash can. You know what I mean? I do this. Well, but Insitome really doesn't have anything to do with that, right? Because we're talking about people giving up their genomes to the public. Right? And so, does Insitome have a view on nefarious actors trying to triangulate into some kind
of course, we don't support anything like that as a company. What we do is we enable you to understand what your genome means, and most of our products at the moment focus on ancestry, and so telling you the history of your DNA. Genetics, by its very nature, is a historical science because we got our genomes from our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and you don't understand really why you have the characteristics you have without understanding something about that ancestry. And so that's really what we're unpacking and telling people about through kind of deep immersive storytelling. We certainly are not involved in anything like trying to capture criminals using consumer genetic tests or whatever. But people, of course, can download their own data. And again, these are personal choices that individuals are making with their own genomic data.
Very good, very interesting. I wonder if we can shift gears a little bit. And I'm always wondering where there's, is there a justice issue, ethics? You know what I mean? Anytime we do a Banner Center event, is there a justice issue? I mean, so is there a redistribution of some kind going on here with this new knowledge based on genomes somehow? One person could be in, and another person could now be out based on what they've discovered.
In or out of what?
Oh, I don't know. The club.
Okay.
Their group, their tribe. You know what I mean?
So
maybe something like that. Can we attend to something like that? I know that's an out there question. You know what I mean? And I don't know. We can. I can go a little further into it if you want, but is this like a biologization of politics? I mean, is there something that could be going on? Have you witnessed anything like that?
Have we witnessed it? No, not directly. I mean, there are online forums where people discuss their results and they over-extrapolate from the 2%, Scandinavian or whatever they might have. You know, I think there's a general misunderstanding of the level of accuracy of some of these tests. Because of that, a lot of the companies have been driven to kind of drill down to the country and regional level, when in fact it's very, very difficult to do that genetically, certainly for European populations who are extremely closely related at the genetic level. And I think there can be misinterpretations as a result of that. You know, we try not to overinterpret the data. We don't report countries typically. You know, when we do report something, we feel pretty confident about it. But yeah, I mean, people want this kind of localized regional information, and they do read a lot into it. In some cases, it does change their sense of identity or who they feel that they belong with.
That's
and it's even been used legally. So there's a case that's recently come up in Washington State, somebody using, quite frankly, a very old school test that did not have very many genetic markers in it, not terribly accurate. But he came up as a small percentage Native American, I believe, and African American or Sub-Saharan African, and on the basis of that, he applied for his small business to be recognized as a minority business. So, you know, people are over-interpreting from very little information, in my opinion. But that's one of the caveats that I think we as, the sellers of the test, the creators of the test, the onus is on us to explain the limitations of these interpretations.
The limitations. Okay, so I guess the next thing, I was going to ask you this a little later, but can you talk about what Insitome, what the product looks like? I mean, it's your Genome Plus, right? It's stories.
Yeah, so it's an app on your iPhone, or it's a website that you can go to. And having tested yourself, we partner with a company called Helix, which is based out in the San Francisco Bay Area. Helix is a spinoff of Illumina, which is the dominant genetic technology company in the world. So most of the nucleotide bases that are generated by sequencing centers, one at Washington University, for instance, come off of Illumina machines. And so Helix is Illumina's play within the consumer genomic space, and they're able to sequence entire exomes for very little money. They have access to special Illumina technology allowing them to do that at a consumer price point. Typically, and an exome, just for background for those of you who are not geneticists, these are the coding regions of the genome, so all the functional genes, the stuff in your genome that's actually doing something that we know about. So Helix is analyzing what they call an exome plus, so it's all of those coding regions and then other scattered sections of your genome. They're able to do that at a price point that is competitive in the consumer space, and typically that means that the test should be under $100. If you do an exome yourself for research purposes today, it's going to cost you $500 or more. And so they have access to this exome technology that allows them to sell into the consumer market. The idea being, you only have to sequence your genome once because you're effectively getting all the information there is. What's going to change over time is our ability to interpret that information. And so Helix really, in my mind, is one step on a path that eventually will lead to everybody having their genome sequenced very early on in life, possibly at birth, when it's close to free and it's very quick and easy to do. I think most of us would choose to do that. And then the question is, how do you use that information? And we can tell you certain things about yourself right now on the basis of genetic data, but that information is only going to get richer over time as more research is done. And so the idea is that your genome, your data, is going to live in the cloud, and you'll download information from the cloud at various points in your life. Maybe you want to find out about tailoring an athletic program, way of training so that you can become a better high school or college athlete. You decide to have kids, you're interested in, are you carrying any recessive alleles that could be bad in combination with those of your spouse. You become interested in ancestry later in life. So at various points in your life, you're going to want to query different things. And then of course, again, with the research that's ongoing, we're going to have more and more accuracy, more details to tell you. And so it's an ongoing relationship with your genome. You only have to sequence once, but you're going to query multiple times, hopefully many times throughout your life. So it's a very ongoing, engaged way of analyzing your genetic data. So Helix is effectively building what they call the app store for consumer genomics. Sequence once, query often. And so we're building apps that are focused at the moment on ancestry.
Got it. Okay. And so so if I want my update, I need to query again. Or do you send email? You know,
we
do you
can.
say, it's an
We'll send
update.
emails
Here,
when
got a new
we
thing for
launch
you.
an update. Yeah.
Okay, you can. It's both directions. You know, politically. So I'm thinking of like indigenous people, right? Other types of genetically related groups like that, who might be against the idea of genomic data being collected on them, right? I don't know. I'm thinking of people protesting in Hammarskjöld Plaza in front of the UN and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Maybe I've seen that before about genomics. You know, I can imagine, someone saying, well, if you don't want your genome tested, just don't have your genome tested. You know what I mean? However, if one member of the group wants to have their DNA tested, you can't stop that one person, right? And so, how would you even know that that person was part of an indigenous group or something like that? I mean,
Well, if those
sensitive
individuals,
those things,
if those individuals choose to test through a consumer product, there's nothing we can do about that. In terms of the research, that was the core of what we were doing in the Genographic project, where we had a group of population geneticists around the world focused on indigenous populations living in their particular corner of the globe, indigenous people being important because they've lived in the same place for a long period of time. Unlike most of us sitting in this room whose ancestors have moved around a lot in the last few hundred years, and our DNA is mixed up as a result and can't really tell you about ancient genetic patterns. We were focusing on the scientific side of the project on working with these indigenous groups. And it's a process to get consent. We need, obviously, individual consent for any individual who chooses to join, but also group consent in this case. And in some cases, certain Native American groups, the Navajo Nation, for instance, has a blanket moratorium on any genetic research. The group has chosen not to be a part of that. And so, we didn't end up sampling any Navajo people.
Wow, okay. I mean, okay, so the business model, the Insitome model is you get your genome analyzed and then you're embellishing it with details about it as they become available.
Right.
I mean, is there just a straight ethics in this? So if you uncover the fact that someone's ancestor was a white supremacist or something, you're not going to.
Luckily, that's not written
put
in
the
your
lipstick
DNA.
on this, right? You're going to just tell them, right? I mean, hopefully that's not going to happen. But you discover something that the person might not want to know. You know what I mean? What about paternity, right? Their grandfather's was not actually their grandfather. You know what I mean? Or something like that. This sort of bad press might be bad for business. Do you divulge the negative along with the good?
Well, there's a potential for the test to be misused. I mean, they're not intended to be paternity tests. And,
Right.
We certainly say that. And in terms of, unexpected results, that's always a possibility. I mean, the wonderful thing about, uncovering all of this genetic information that we all carry inside of ourselves is that it is this, unknown book. And it's tremendously relevant to who we are, where we came from, who we are today, the traits we have in the here and now, and potentially what may happen to us in the future as we think about, medical conditions that might arise and so on. And we don't know what's inside that book until we start to read it. And there may be some unexpected things when we open up the text.
Yeah. And if it's not good, you're going to just...
But by and large, people are, they're fascinated and amazed when they get the results. I mean, there's a reason these tests are so popular. If they were consistently producing scary, bad results, then no one would do it.
Exactly. There'd be no business.
So,
All right. Okay. Do you prepare people?
We certainly say, this may reveal something that is inconsistent with your sense of, your history.
Yeah. You mentioned, I think, that you sequence the exome, right? Which is part of, it's not a whole genome
It's
sequence.
not a whole genome, no. So we end up sequencing, Helix ends up sequencing about 2% of the whole genome. But again, it's the functional parts of the genome.
Okay, the functional parts. All right, so, so it's a percentage of the entire thing, right? So how do you know, don't you think like the percentage you select could tell quite a different story than a percentage that you might otherwise select? I mean, let me explain that better. You're doing parts A, C, and F, right? What if you instead decide to do D, Q, and X? You know what I mean? The story could be different, or it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way for ancestry purposes,
Okay.
because once you get over around, let's say 40 to 50,000 variable positions, when you're using these models that we use, the structure models for looking at population affiliations and so on, it really doesn't matter which region you're looking at. You could just be using random genetic variants. We try to scatter them around the genome to get over any potential inherent bias having to do with a particular location in the genome that's been subject to selection, and thus the frequencies are somewhat skewed. But in general, I mean, that's the power of this way of testing for ancestry, as opposed to something like the CODIS markers that I mentioned before with the FBI, where you're looking at a dozen positions. Literally, when you're looking at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of positions, you get much more accurate representations of these ancestry percentages. Now, what can throw off the analysis is the reference sets that you use in your comparisons. So this is how the analysis actually works. You take all of these variable positions and you say, based on the particular set of markers you have, who in the world are you closest to from our database? And if you choose, populations that are skewed toward one region of the world, you're going to get a different answer than if you choose populations skewed toward another region of the world. And this is, a complaint that some of the companies have had is, people of non-European ancestry, for the most part, the people who have tested are largely of European ancestry, so the companies have tended to skew in that direction. People who are, say, Korean or Japanese or Malaysian, are told often you're East Asian, which is unedifying. They knew that and they want more detail.
Right, exactly.
It's as though, you were British and you were told you're Western Eurasian. So, that's a potential issue, and it's one that, we're certainly trying to take into account as we develop better and better tests, and I think the other companies are as well.
Great. Okay. Interesting facet of this, I would say. I like that. Well, let me ask you one more question, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience. And I want to make sure, do we have a microphone for the audience? Great. Okay. I just want to make sure. Let's do this. So it's a medical test. Medical tests have false positives and false negatives. There's no perfect test, right? We learned this at day 3 of medical school, right? I mean, so this is a medical test too. Do you try to explain to people about false negatives and false positives before they get their data?
Well, we are not personally doing anything medical.
Right, okay, it's not medical. Okay, so
that again is highly regulated by the FDA in part for that reason. But yes, the companies that are doing that, this is a concern. I mean, 23andMe earlier this year got permission to test for breast cancer variants, the BRCA1 and 2 genes. They chose 3 variants that are at high frequency in Ashkenazi Jewish populations. They tend to be at relatively low frequency overall in the population, but they're at elevated frequency in certain Ashkenazi Jewish populations. And the problem there is not that you're going to have false positives necessarily. It's the negative results that concern me and the medical ethicists more, because number one, those are not the only variants in the BRCA1 and 2 genes that do predispose to breast cancer. So simply being negative for those 3 doesn't mean you're out of the woods. And the worry is that you're going to give people a false sense of, oh, you can relax now because you have nothing to worry about genetically. In that case, a false positive, you would never act on that information on your own. You would always make a decision with your physician who would want to retest you using a different clinical test, confirm the results, and presumably that would be picked up at that point. But yeah, clinical testing is heavily regulated for a reason.
Yeah. I think one direction we could go is just the reliance on physicians and the front line of clinical care
and genetic counselors and people who are in short supply these days. I mean, this is something that many people are partaking in. So probably by the end of this year, 30 million people will have tested their DNA through these consumer tests. And so, that's kind of racing ahead of the capacity of the medical community to deal with the interpretation. You get patients coming into their general practitioner who, may have taken genetics 30 years ago when it was about trisomies and Down syndrome, and, SNPs were never mentioned, genomic sequencing wasn't a part of the curriculum. People coming in with their results and saying, what does this mean? And, to a large extent, it's a lot of noise to that primary care doctor. They really don't know how to kind of incorporate that into the treatment regime.
Yeah, I recently learned that we have part of our medical school curricula involves medical students getting that exact assignment. So they get into a group of 6, they get a standardized patient or an acting patient who comes into with a report, and they say, Doc, interpret this, so it's there, it's happening.
Yep.
I think we're doing it. I think a lot of other medical schools have that probably also.
It's good. We have to prepare for the future.
It's a way of preparing, but what else? So I think let's leave that open-ended. I guess I wonder if we can open it up to the audience. I love how many people are in this room. Thank you so much. Let's start it off with Joel. Joel, could you introduce yourself a little bit and ask your question? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Joel Eisenberg. I'm professor of biochemistry and molecular biology. My PhD is in genetics. So this is an area of intense interest to me. And I wanted to sort of try to nail the speaker down a little bit more specifically on his position on the disintermediation of medical information, medical genomics information, because it's really a raging debate in the medical community among physicians whether, well, not direct-to-consumer genomics, but consumer genomics is ethical, and whether patients, individuals, in the absence of the intermediation of a physician, ought to be allowed to see their genetic, that it might be dangerous to get this type of information. I mean, this is not new. Long before there was 23andMe, it was possible to ascertain paternity. And about a level of 2 to 5% of the time, people came in looking for other information, got the unwelcome information that their custodial father was not their biological father for the first time. So now we have people like Angelina Jolie, who finds out that she has one of the high-risk BRCA alleles, gets an elective double mastectomy and ovariectomy, which of course you can't get without a physician. But other people might take other actions or just become clinically depressed or commit suicide based on this information. So I understand you make money off of getting this information out there, but if you can step back from that role and explain why you think it's ethical to disintermediate this information.
Yeah, so let's separate.
Disintermediate? Can you just
So
say
disintermediate meaning, bypassing a caregiver who's going to do the interpretation. So you're going directly to the genetic tester, getting your results back directly, not going by a physician or a genetic counselor. So let's disconnect the ancestry testing from the medical testing. I don't really think there is a significant risk with ancestry testing. Obviously, if you use the test in such a way that you're skewing it to find out something maybe you shouldn't be finding out, so you use it as a paternity test, which in principle you could, even though the companies say, this is not intended to be a paternity test, it's not admissible in court, et cetera, you may find out something a little surprising, or perhaps not surprising, depending on the case. So let's talk about the medical testing. To the extent that it empowers people to be healthier, I think it is absolutely worthwhile. I mean, if you test for one of these 3 BRCA variants on a 23andMe test and you come up positive for one, to the extent that that gets you into the doctor's office and has you follow up and you do confirmatory testing through a proper clinical lab and perhaps make a decision that may save your life, that's a positive thing. Are there potential, negatives to this? Of course, and this is where you get into, for instance, testing for some of the high penetrance alleles for ApoE, ApoE4, which you can't do anything about, and which are highly predictive of late onset Alzheimer's. There's no evidence, though, that people, are necessarily reacting in a terrible way to that information. There have been a few studies done, a few longitudinal studies done. And in general, people feel empowered by the data. The other issue with medical testing for me is that a lot of the things that we can say genetically with some high level of accuracy, they're relatively rare genetic variants. And so for the average person who's probably curious about common diseases like type 2 diabetes and hypertension and so on, there unfortunately is not that much we can say genetically right now. And the advice that we tend to give with or without genetic results is the same advice that we would have given a generation ago, which is lose weight, exercise more, don't smoke, all of that good stuff. So to the extent, though, that that we're getting tens of millions of people a year who are testing themselves, and you may pick up some genetic variants that are, at reasonable frequencies in the population. I'm thinking about something like hemochromatosis, which is, an iron-loading disorder that's very common in Northern European populations. Most people never realize they have it until they show up in their late 40s or early 50s at their doctors with cirrhosis, and they say, but I don't drink heavily. And the doctor says, well, let's do a test. Oh, well, you've been overloading on iron for the last 30 years, and that's the reason why you have this disease. And it's a very easy disease to treat. All you have to do is give blood regularly. So phlebotomy, a little bit more often than the average person is donating blood, will keep you from having any of these symptoms and developing a disease. But you don't know that you have that until you test for it. So to the extent that we can, implement that as a public health measure as part of this consumer testing, I think that's a net positive for individuals.
Great. Let's go in the far back. Just get, if you could speak into the microphone and introduce yourself, if that's okay with you?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Bill Hudson. I am 0.8% Neanderthal and 100% American. Thank you very much, Dr. Wells. A really fascinating subject. My question attempts to bring maybe two subjects into the ethical realm. And as we know, there are many cognitive tests used in employment, recruiting, and screening, Myers-Briggs being a popular one that many people are aware of. But it's a predictor of behaviors and the type of employee you might be bringing in. And it's based on cognitive testing, really. Mm-hmm. So my question is, do you see a way where this genomic testing can maybe be merged with that to bring in some trait-type testing that becomes a reliable predictor of behaviors of a person?
Wow, talk about an ethical minefield.
Well, the reason why I bring it up is a lot of people they don't like these psychological tests and they have an ethical problem with them. And, you can use them because someone signs off and says it's okay. So that's my question. Do you see a way where this maybe can add to that, to strengthen it, the two of them coming together?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it brings us really to the forefront in genetic research, particularly a type of research known as GWAS, or genome-wide association studies, and attempting to disentangle the genetic components of personality, behavior, intelligence. It's very early days, and even with millions of people who are being tested in these studies, there was a study published a couple of months ago on educational attainment as a proxy for intelligence. You're only explaining a tiny percentage of the variance in individual outcomes using genetic data, so it's still very early days. There's a lot of work remaining to be done. We are certainly not at the point where you would ever consider doing a genetic test as a proxy for a personality test in order to hire someone. Not to mention the fact that it's illegal. Because under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, you cannot discriminate on the basis of employment, health insurance, and several other things based on someone's genetic makeup. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't apply to long-term care or to life insurance. I feel like GINA should be broadened to include those, and we should all be part of one genetic risk pool. But anyway, that's a political question rather than a scientific question. But I don't see the testing being anywhere near ready for prime time to be applied in that way. Not yet.
I wonder if we can get another voice. How about over here? Yeah. Yes, sir, right here in the middle. Yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah.
I'm a sociologist, not a biologist. There seems to be pretty good evidence that personal genomics has really taken a whack out of the long-term care insurance business. And one of the sort of unanticipated consequences of this. There are other things out there like that. The question is not just about personality, but the extent to which employers will look at this and say, oh, and I understand that it's not legal, but you have to be the concern that as long as we have employee-based insurance, this opens another whole Pandora's box. And then there's an even broader question that's a societal question is, what's the impact of all of this on assortative mating? So there are a lot
Those
of
are
really
big
interesting
questions,
issues here.
and I certainly don't have all the answers to them. Again, speaking as a scientist and as somebody who focuses on ancestry rather than the medical testing, I feel that this is interesting information. People are driven by curiosity to find out more about themselves. When you get into the medical testing, particularly in the case of, diseases that are chronic, that have a genetic component, but are not actionable given your genetic knowledge, that's where you get into this very interesting gray realm ethically. And should we necessarily be giving people this information without counseling, without explaining what the outcomes might be, including the outcomes for discrimination, whether it's in the insurance markets or potentially employment, even though technically it's illegal? That, I think, is the debate we need to be having, that very focused debate on that particular zone, not on genetic testing more broadly, because again, I think most of genetic testing, doesn't fall into that scary realm, but I think there is that little segment where, it is potentially, very scary. You're right.
How about Abe? If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Abe. I'm a PhD student here in healthcare ethics. I just had a couple of questions. The first one was, is it true that if you send, your saliva to like several different ancestry companies or whatever, that you'll get different results? And if so, why is that? And then secondly, I don't really understand why a company would want to buy my genomic information. So could you say a little bit more about why that's of interest to somebody else?
Yeah, sure. So start with the beginning question. Why do you get different ancestry results with different companies? It really has to do with the reference populations they're using and the degree to which they're trying to drill down into particular subregions, often in Europe. I've spoken to people even on this visit who have gotten some anomalous results even within their own families. And it has to do with combinations that the testing company probably has not seen before, and trying to fit that into a model, and all of this is based on statistical models of how populations diverge over time, fit that into a model for how you explain the percentages that somebody's carrying. And so it really often comes down to these regional ancestry populations and the reference set, as we call it, and how those were chosen. As to why you're getting slightly different results. If people didn't insist on getting that really fine-grained, detailed, you're from northwestern France or southeastern England, that kind of result, I think we would see fewer anomalous results. And in part, as I said before, that's because Europeans are so very, very close to each other. So you're really kind of on the knife edge of what it's possible to say genetically. It gets into some very complex population genetics if you're doing it properly. Now, in terms of why any company might want to pay for this information, if you have phenotypic information attached to the genetic data, which, 23andMe has a lot of surveys and people have shared a lot of information, it potentially allows you to find new targets for drugs. That's what GSK is thinking here, is, you may find genetic associations in a disease state that have not been seen before. And they're in a new enzyme or a molecule that has never been seen as being involved in this particular pathway or this disorder. You might be able to develop a drug for that. That is, in principle, what they're trying to do. Whether it's going to pay off, I don't know. But this is the race in big pharma right now, is to come up with substantially different classes of drugs to be able to treat things that we've never been able to treat before. The low-hanging fruit has already been found. Using genetics, using standard, pharmaceutical techniques, and with the way they've developed drug targets and drugs in the past. And so the question is how do you move the goalposts? How do you, really make a dent in type 2 diabetes or, whatever it is that you're focusing on? And so they're taking a lot of, big bets, and genetics will play a role in that. They might find some new target that allows them to develop the next blockbuster drug, the next statin. That's the hope, certainly.
Great. Let's do one more. And I think Michael has had his hand up a little while, and Michael's on our board. He's a board member of the Bander Center for Medical Business Ethics, so thank you.
Also a professor of international business and finance at the University of Missouri St. Louis and the College of Business, and so I want to take more of the business tack approach with you. The ethics of monetization of data. Have you thought, and are you looking at the fact that the network effect of the Googles and Facebooks, the Baidus, the Tencents have colonized this data and monopolized the monetization of it? Europe seems to be taking a different tack with the General Data Protection Act to say we own it individually. You can put this marker on your credit card, you can put this marker on your data. Do you see us starting to have like loyalty cards where if you want to use my data for medical research and you're going to patent a pharmaceutical outcome, do I get to own part of that intellectual property that I donated to?
That's a very good question. You know, you mentioned the social media companies, and you know they're offering these services for free, and you have to ask yourself, you know, what's the product if the service I'm using is free? And you know, as the old saw goes, you are the product. Basically, your attention, your data, et cetera. To a certain extent, for a lot of consumer genomics, you are also the product. So in the case of 23andMe, data aggregation, eventually trying to find new, you know, therapeutic targets. I mentioned earlier that there are now 5 or 6 blockchain-based genomics companies that have been founded, which I think is a step in the direction that you're talking about, people retaining control over their data, even though it may end up being aggregated into one of these studies or one of these cohorts. You know, you can track that and you can see when something comes out of that analysis, and maybe you can share in the benefits of it in some way. We haven't really set up a system that allows us to do that yet. You know, when you're dealing with millions and millions, tens of millions of people, and you know, entire genomes worth of data, it's a very interesting question. You know, to the extent that you contribute incrementally in a very, very small way to something that may be incredibly valuable to a large corporation, to what extent should you share in that? You know, this is a very important debate that I think we need to be having. Again, it goes beyond just the genetic side of things. It, you know, verges into social media and sharing personal data more generally.
Spencer, thank you so much.
Yeah,
That was great.
good discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, I want to thank everyone for coming. If you would like CME, like if you're a physician, you want CME, please find your way to our CME sign-in sheet. We encourage everyone to sign up for our Bander Center email list, and that'll keep you abreast of future events. On Thursday, November 8 at 4 o'clock, we're going to interview our former medical school dean, Phil Alderson, about artificial intelligence in healthcare. And on Friday, December 7th in the morning, ethnographer and bioethicist Harold Braswell, who's on our faculty, will interview health economists Gerald Friedman and Wendell Potter about the economic arguments underlying single-payer healthcare. Please follow us on social media. We are on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, and we'd love to have more followers. Our PowerPoint slide has the handles for both of those. So if you're interested in donating to our center, we would love to talk to you about that. We're always trying to grow. If you'd like to be more involved in a different way, we'd welcome that too. I want to start with a big thank you to the St. Louis University Homecoming Planners, who have so graciously hosted us. Mike Higgins of the School of Medicine can't thank you enough. Stephen Bander, our benefactor. I'd also like to thank KETC Channel 9, the local PBS affiliate, for the audio and video recording and for producing the video version of this event, which you'll find on YouTube in the next several weeks. To our staff, Gunnar O'Brien, Denise Webb, our med student managers, Matt Gracca, Annie Seskleifer, and Jeff Carbonella, and to everyone who showed up and participated in this dialogue today. And of course, thank you to Spencer Wells. So please join us for a drink and a snack. It's in that room. We have to go through that door in the back and go all the way across and talk to us. So continue the conversation. Try to talk to somebody in this networking event that you've never met before. See if that happens. This is a great opportunity to network. So please enjoy yourselves, and I can't wait to meet all of you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.